Okay, the time has come. So thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar. We've got a great team collaborating together to provide everyone some advice and insights on current challenges and obstacles facing the cybersecurity industry. So some general housekeeping items I want to cover before we begin. Quick introduction to myself. My name is Caroline Wood, and I work at NetGain Technologies as a marketing administrator, and I'm going to be moderating the webinar today. Questions are encouraged throughout the webinar. Please use the question option in the bottom of your screen to submit any comments or questions. We're going to try to answer as many as we can in the Q&A portion of the webinar today. A recorded version of this presentation is going to be sent to all registrants, and it's going to be made available on the NetGain website as well. We'll send an email sharing those details within the next couple of days. And finally, if you've got any questions about the content or topics we cover in this webinar, please feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to meet with you or share any additional content and information about these security topics that we cover today and more. And then last but certainly not least, we do have some e-gift giveaways for this webinar. So be sure to stay tuned into the whole webinar session today. So let's get this cybersecurity party started. I'll begin with some general introductions to our security experts who are going to be weighing in on the topics we're covering today. So we've got representatives from both NetGain Technologies and Arctic Wolf Networks with us, and they will both have a lot of background and experience in the cybersecurity industry that's going to be great insights for what we're covering today. So let's go around the room and I'll let them introduce themselves, their roles, as well as a little bit about their background experience. So I'm going to give the floor to Mike Sonic first.
Yeah, hi everybody. Like Caroline said, my name is Mike Sonic. I am an account representative with Arctic Wolf, who we specifically deal with cybersecurity. That's what we do. And a little bit of background on me, I actually used to work for an MSP in the Minnesota area that was very similar to NetGain in size and kind of what they did for their customers. So I've experienced in cybersecurity working with folks like Scott Logan going back about 5 years now. So excited to be here and kind of go through what we have prepared today.
Thanks, Mike. We're excited to have you. And now I'd like to introduce NetGain's very own Scott Logan.
Yep, and my name is Scott Logan, and I am the Director of Security for NetGain Technologies. I've been with NetGain now for 15 years, and me and my team of security experts provide security protection for NetGain as an MSP in protecting the clients that we support and service, but we also provide individual security support and assistance for clients that need security posturing, security updating, security direction, and maybe in alignment with compliance or other requirements. So really look forward to sharing the information with you guys today. And Caroline, I'll give it back to you.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it. So now that we've introduced the team, let's move on into the actual content of this webinar. Today, we're going to be delving into the current state of affairs regarding the cybersecurity industry and which it's needing to scale at an unprecedented rate due to the dramatic rise in cybercrime taking place really across the globe. So this webinar, we're going to focus on the current state of cyber risk in 2022 with a recap of some significant security events in recent years. And this is going to lead us directly into a discussion of how these events have created fundamental challenges for security agencies. We're also going to cover modern cybersecurity best practices and suggestions for how businesses can level up their security stance. And finally, we're going to have some open time for Q&A towards the end, where we'll take some time to cover your questions and comments too. So let's begin by breaking down what's led to our current state of cyber risk in 2022. So cybersecurity is now really just a recurring headline in the news and most digital media outlets, and with details of recent cyber attacks, breaches, and ransomware events. It's really crippling businesses, small businesses to large enterprise institutions. So really, we're on high alert. So Mike, I'm going to give the floor to you first. Can you kind of give us a bit of background and history into helping us understand what's brought us to this point today?
Yeah, so I think this is a really important quote, right? 90% of security leaders believe their organization is falling short when it comes to addressing cyber risk, right? So that's a pretty jarring large statistic, right? That 90% of these security leaders don't feel like their organization is doing enough when it comes to cyber risk. And I think that lays a good kind of groundwork for the entirety of this webinar, right? What does that mean exactly? So let's kind of dive into that. Why is that the case, and what's happened in 2021 to lead security leaders to believing that they're falling short in addressing cyber risk?
Yeah, now Scott, you gave a presentation about cyber insurance to the Kentucky Bankers Association and how it's at a whole new level in 2022. So Scott, can you talk about these changes a little bit and some of what SMBs are doing to prepare themselves for these imminent attacks?
Well, in that particular webinar, Caroline, we were talking about how cyber insurance has been impacted by the amount of threat and cyber attacks that have been going on out there. And cyber insurance, basically, a few years ago, they were able to insure your business with the ideology that no matter what happens to your business, we're going to be able to financially support you through this breach. But as cyber threat increased, especially through 2021, the numbers that are out there approach the 20 billion mark, and cyber insurance companies were taking it on the chin. They weren't able to meet the amount of impact, this financial impact that these businesses were being damaged by in association with these different types of attacks like ransomware, for example. And a lot of the financial impact didn't include the reputational damage that associated with the threat. And so that also had a significant amount of impact for organizations, some of them to the point where the business couldn't survive. And that obviously is unfortunate. But these cyber insurance companies, when they decided, especially through this year in 2022, they have changed their model. They have changed the requirements that it takes in order to either achieve cyber insurance or renew cyber insurance. There's new things that you have to be doing, certain controls that have to be in place in order to meet the requirements to maintain that insurance. And sometimes they're not going to offer what they used to. Like they may have given you a $10 million support, and they may reduce that now to 5 in 2022. They're just reducing their footprint. And so cybercrime has had an enormous impact on businesses. It's had an enormous impact on cyber insurance and being protective for businesses. And these numbers just continually grow. In ransomware, in the first 6 months of 2021, the numbers jumped up over 60% in ransomware types of attacks. And the amount of the demands associated to ransomware exceeded 225%. Those are crazy numbers that businesses had to deal with. And so cybercrime's on the up. Cybercrime is not a guy sitting in his basement anymore. These are crime syndicates. These are large organizations, sometimes nation state actors that are actually trying to force some level of influence into these organizations, whether it's trying to take data out, some level of exfiltration, or if it's just simply demanding money. And they've changed their approach on how they do that. They no longer just encrypt some files and say, I need some money for getting your files back. Now they're actually damaging the environments. They're shutting down systems. They're removing controls that are protective. They're even influencing backups so that you have no recoverable model. And that forces you into maybe having to pay the demand for receiving that information back. So cybercrime's up, and the government has classified a large number of groups as being critical infrastructure. And some of those groups include like energy and social media, pro services and IT like MSPs, like NetGain is, and financial services like banks and obviously healthcare industries are all critical infrastructure that's under a major influence of these types of attacks. Mike, what are you seeing from the Arctic Wolf side?
Yeah, a lot of what you just mentioned, Scott. And I think one thing that's important to look at on the slide that we're looking at, right, is that these attackers have become more sophisticated, like you mentioned, right? They're not just some guy in his basement. They are groups, like you said, sometimes nation states or whatever. But what we're really seeing from our end is that they are starting to target smaller organizations. And the reason that they're doing that is they're looking at smaller organizations as low-hanging fruit, right? They're not looking at these small organizations as, they're not worth our time, they're too small. They're looking at them as, hey, there's an easy point of entry within this network because they're falling short on securing their environment. Well, we're going to go after that, right? And they've done so many different things where they've automated tools in order to breach companies and gain footholds within networks that, hey, they're looking around and going, what's the easiest point of entry? What's the quickest way we can get kind of a bang for our buck from an effort standpoint? And that's what we're seeing a lot of is folks that previously didn't think they were a target are all of a sudden going, hey, we got locked up with ransomware, or we had a business email compromise. And I think that's kind of the big takeaway that I took from the FBI Internet Crime Report was that this is no longer a, hey, this is just large organizations that become the victim. It's everybody and anybody, right? It could be a nonprofit that only has 30 folks in there. It really doesn't matter. Everybody's kind of got a bullseye on their back at this point.
Yeah, and the CISA has put out, in combination with the FBI, a Shields Up campaign to let all of this critical infrastructure know that you guys need to be aware of what's going on. And like you said, Mike, these are normally not targeted attacks. They're not actually going after certain industries. There are script kiddies out there that are just looking for, as you stated, open ports, some level of forward-facing interface that they can manipulate, something that's flawed in an operating system that they can exploit and take control over. So it's usually random. Somebody trips over the tripwire and causes the infection, and that's where they take their foothold.
Yep.
Yeah, so seamless transition to our next topic of, kind of looking into some notable cybercrime events that have occurred within the past couple of years. Here's just a few that I imagine most of you have probably heard about. I would like to kind of get Scott and Mike's insight on some of these events. So Scott, I'm going to start off with you. Can you share some info about the first event on the list, the Microsoft Exchange Server event?
So Microsoft Exchange Server attack. This was, I think, earlier in 2021, back in March, I believe, when it first happened. And it was labeled Hafnium. Now, Hafnium wasn't the attack. Hafnium was the group that initiated the attack. This was a Chinese state-sponsored group that initiated this influence against a known or discovered vulnerability within the Exchange platform. And the Exchange, obviously the mail server platform. This dealt with an on-premise model. So if you had an on-prem Exchange server, there was a known vulnerability that Microsoft immediately started applying patches for to try to plug in that hole, but it had enough influence that I think I saw 21,000 organizations were influenced or impacted by this particular Hafnium attack. And what that Hafnium attack allowed them to do was basically get an RCE or a remote code execution vulnerability where they could actually take over the organization. They can take over a login within the enterprise and elevate it to an administrative power to where it can manipulate the rest of the organization. So it was a very damaging amount of influence, but it was a single point of influence with it was just the Exchange server. So that particular vulnerability was something that was easily exploited and created an enormous amount of impact. And speaking of other enormous amount of impacts, the Colonial Pipeline attack influenced thousands of systems and organizations around the US. And that particular attack wasn't because of a vulnerability that was built into the architecture of the platform. It was influenced by a username and a password that was identified on the dark web that allowed a VPN that was still active to be influenced and allowed them to get in the door and execute. So it doesn't have to be something that's flawed within the internet. It could be simply somebody had a back door that was left open and that door was influenced by it. But zero-day impacts have been very rampant in 2022. Mike, what can you share about the Log4j?
Yeah, the Log4j is also another very kind of public one, right? And it was a zero-day vulnerability. And this one really caught the attention of IT teams everywhere, right? And so the reality is that if you're running a business or an organization, you're probably using some form of Java, right? I think, Scott, you and I were talking about how there was people who had this vulnerability that didn't know they had the vulnerability. So it was very kind of like all hands on deck, right? Because this is a zero-day vulnerability. Almost, every organization is susceptible to a potential attack. And what I want to talk about with this one in particular was kind of Arctic Wolf's response to this, right? So obviously, very big deal vulnerability. And what happened is we picked up on this through some of our external vulnerability scans. And what we did was we actually called every single one of our 3,500 plus customers, told them about the vulnerability. Ultimately, we wrote a script that we released publicly for that, but made sure that our clients' networks were patched, right? That we're going, hey, this is a very serious vulnerability. This is something that could bring your business down. Let's mitigate this and let's get this fixed so you can kind of move ahead accordingly and feel safe and secure with your environment. That was also one, you mentioned, Scott, the Colonial pipeline was very, very public. So was the Log4j, really kind of caught IT teams and kept them up at night.
Yeah, and what we experienced at NetGain as an MSP is unlike Microsoft Exchange Server vulnerability, which impacted a single server, a single architecture. It had 4 different 0 days associated with the hafnium, but they were still patchable within that enterprise. Log4j didn't have a home. It lived in many, many applications, hundreds of applications. And so you had to patch each one. And there wasn't a single patch to get down. So you had to go to the vendor to get a certain patch from that vendor to be able to apply that to, if you're using that particular JavaScript or whatever, wherever it was coming from, you had to patch it independently. And so it was a nightmare of administration. And I'm sure you saw that as well from Arctic Wolf standpoint.
Absolutely.
On that note, I want to transition into more of the current state of affairs for the cybersecurity industry. So as Scott and Mike have both attested to, attacks are coming at businesses from all angles, and it's getting harder and harder for IT and security teams to protect your company, your data, your employees, et cetera. So here's a quote from Gartner to kind of set the stage for our forthcoming discussion. Many security teams have overinvested in a plethora of tools. As a result, they are also suffering from alert fatigue and multiple console complexity and facing the challenges in recruiting and retaining security operations analysts with the right set of skills and expertise to effectively use all those tools. So as Gartner pointed out, one major challenge for cybersecurity professionals today is alert fatigue. So Mike, your team has tripled in size over the past few months to meet the increased need for security support from our partners and clients. So can you share some insights on what the alert influx has been looking like for your folks at Arctic Wolf?
Yeah, and I think this goes directly back, right, to the quote that we just saw, right? There's too much noise out there. And I think one of the things that a lot of internal IT teams deal with, right? I know Scott and I have always had this conversation, is this thing that we call alert fatigue, meaning, hey, we invested in this tool and it's really great, right? This new shiny object, but it's spitting out hundreds of alerts a day and we don't know what to do with that, right? We can't make sense of it. We don't have the time, we have other priorities, whatever it may be. So one of the things that it becomes very challenging is kind of prioritizing those alerts, right? And security teams, IT teams in general struggle with that. And some of what we'll talk about is further down the webinar is how Arctic Wolf and NetGain can help make sense of those alerts and how there's not vendor fatigue. And this really goes back to kind of like one of the reasons Arctic Wolf exists, right? Is we had this belief that there was this tool-based mindset to if you put a tool in for cybersecurity, you're good to go, right? You have this new shiny tool. Well, some of the things that come out of that are this too much noise and alert fatigue. And I'm sure, Scott, you probably have something to add on that, working with internal IT teams hand in hand every day.
Well, like you mentioned, there's so many tools that are out there, from antivirus tools to logging tools to there's so much out there that creates all of this influence of information that can be used to recognize threat, identify something that may be happening malicious within the enterprise. But if you don't have eyes to it, if you don't have people that are actually sorting through that information to be able to provide that understanding, then it's just lost work. And that amount of influence to an IT team is just damaging. The IT team is busy enough trying to take care of the things that fail on a day-to-day basis, to let alone try to take care of managing the amount of influence that these tools are producing, the amount of noise that these tools are producing. It becomes very challenging for most IT teams to work within that.
And on that same note, another challenge facing teams is going to be the security skill shortage. So moving right along into our next topic is, labor crisis. Specifically for the IT industry, it's becoming a very competitive market for finding and retaining top talent. So Scott, can you talk to us a little bit about the security skills shortage within the industry and maybe some of the challenges that face some of the companies you've worked with who've come to you needing some additional help and support?
Yeah, I keep referring to all my real life experiences, and this is no different. I've done risk assessments and vulnerability assessments for organizations for almost 10 years, and it is almost a constant theme that I see IT guys trying to wear security hats, and that's unfortunate for them. They're not certified. They're not trained in order to be able to provide the proper amount of security posturing and direction for organizations. It's just a bad place. And when auditors come in and they ask who the security professional is, and they find out it's the IT guy, they're not happy about that because it's just not the right job. It's not the right role. Your security professional should be somebody that's properly trained in order to put the organization in the proper direction for getting their security structured. And so what's happening is that a lot of these organizations, the reason why they put the IT guy in that position is that they're in an area that it's very difficult to find talent in those areas, or if they are able to find talent, maintain or keep that talent. A lot of times cyber guys, they'll get trained up, they get certed up, and then they go to the next highest dollar. And that's unfortunate for a lot of businesses too. Very challenging for businesses in this particular area of getting the security influence that they need and getting that talent to stay on board once they are able to acquire it. And that's why there are programs out there like, NetGain offers a virtual chief security officer program to leverage a security pro at the organization to help them out. That's not a full-time, but offers those services throughout the year. And those are great ways for businesses to kind of manage this particular problem with security shortage, but it is certainly a problem that a lot of the different businesses out there are facing.
Yeah, Mike, could you weigh in on this a little bit too, as to how maybe Arctic Wolf is trying to ramp up their teams too to kind of meet this security skill shortage?
Yeah, definitely. And so one of the things that Arctic Wolf has done is that we have taken the approach of we've actually put a lot of our SOC locations in areas where that talent exists, right? Meaning like we'll put a SOC in the area where we know there's a university that has a cybersecurity program, right? So that we can kind of easily recruit, if you will. And one of the things that we're trying to do, much like Scott's virtual CISO program, right, is we're trying to bring that security talent to you, right? We have the full SOC of, 400 plus SOC engineers, and we put a lot of effort, time into retaining those employees, making sure that they're happy, compensated accordingly, right? So we can bring those services to clients that maybe can't afford them, or like Scott said, are in one of those areas where it's really hard to find security talent in specific areas. It's not a problem that I see going away, right, Scott? It's not something that next year is going to be fixed, right? It's going to continue on. It seems like the gap continues to grow as time goes on, as far as like jobs open and the talent that's actually out there.
Yeah, and then going back to that alert fatigue, this is where those SOC pros come in balance. Now you've got somebody that you can leverage to manage that alert fatigue and be able to take on and ingest all of that information and provide the necessary information for IT to be able to respond to anything that actually is threatening.
And that is a perfect transition into the next challenge I want to bring up, which is response time. So as the phrase goes, time is money, but in the case of a breach, it can be a lot more than that. So Mike, could you share some insights on the financial impacts of breaches and what quick remediation can do to kind of mitigate the impacts of a cyber attack?
Yeah, and so I think one of the important things to kind of start out here in understanding what dwell time is, and it's really how long a bad guy is on your network, right, to simplify it. And depending on what source you look at, you'll find that the mean time to detect someone on your network is about 200 plus days, which is obviously a dramatic period of time for someone to be on your network and for someone to be sitting there and kind of watching and observing kind of what's going on and making decisions on what they want to do as far as compromising your network, right? So it is really kind of scary when you think about somebody can be sitting there watching, paying attention, and it'd take me 200 plus days to identify that. And I think one of the things that I always think about when I think about like ransomware and time to detect is that the average downtime for ransomware is about 21 days, right? And so if you're a manufacturing company or really any business, right, what does that impact of being down for 21 days have to your business from a monetary standpoint, along with, you know, things like customers asking you questions, reputation in the community, whatever that looks like, right? Those harder things to quantify, those all kind of factor into the conversation. And I think what's really tough is kind of how do you reduce that response time, right? What can you do? You know, Scott, we've talked about things like IT resource constrained teams, or you don't have that talent on staff, right? That's somebody who's an expert in security that could identify some of these things. And one of the things that Arctic Wolf does, and I think we do it better than anybody in the industry, is our actual mean time to identify a threat on your network is 30 minutes or less, meaning that we're going to identify somebody on your network and tell you what's going on and lay out a remediation plan, right? And that's really, there's a dramatic difference between 30 minutes and 200 plus days. And if you think about how you're trying to mitigate and respond and recover to threats, that response time is critically important. I know, Scott, you've seen obviously live situations where the response time has been critical. I'm sure you have live examples or something to add here.
Oh man, you know, these actors, they get in those networks and they move so low and slow that it's very difficult to recognize them. They don't trip over anything that's flagging. They're able to kind of skirt security controls that are out there trying to identify the threat, and they're just learning. They're not really doing anything threatening at that time. That's probably why they're not tripping over any wires, but they're just learning. And once they kind of get a complete idea of how they can best influence the organization, do they initiate their attack and start their influence. So having something that is capable of reducing that response time is an enormous impact for a business to stay safe. And like I mentioned back in when I was talking about ransomware, how it can go after those backups, having a recoverable model built into your enterprise, something that's verified that you can get your data back, is certainly important for an organization to have in place.
And on that note, talking about some different security tools and practices to better protect your business, I'm going to move on to our next topic. So security tools are you know, a significant variable that businesses should be considering or reconsidering. As cybercrime has become more complex, so too must our proactive approaches to securing data in our network. So Scott, can you tell us a little bit about EDR and other tools that should be considered as businesses ramp up their security practices?
EDR, endpoint detection and response. That's certainly important, especially since organizations have shifted to a remote workforce. Having all of these endpoints that are out there that are no longer under the protection of the gateway of the primary infrastructure or the core infrastructure, it's certainly important to have something out there that is monitoring that endpoint, looking for some level of influence, some level of threat that may be existing on that, especially if they have a VPN or something like that that allows it to connect back to the core infrastructure that could bring that threat back home or back into the primary data. So having something at that endpoint level is certainly important. Here's the misinformation. The thing that I think confuses a lot of people is that's all I need. I need an endpoint detection response program so that my endpoints stay protected, because keep in mind, that's all it does, is it stays at the endpoint. It's doing a reflection of what's happening on that endpoint and reporting it accordingly. But that is all it does. It cannot manage it once it leaves the endpoint. It can't manage it before it gets to the endpoint. You need something a little bit stronger than that. What does Arctic Wolf offer?
Yeah, and Scott, that's really well said about kind of endpoint detection, right? It's important and you need to have it, but it's not the whole piece of the pie, as you can see right here. And I think, one thing that we're doing with Arctic Wolf that I think is different is we're going to look at the entirety of your threat landscape. Scott mentioned it, right? EDR is important, especially with this shift to remote work. But really, that's only a sliver of what you need to be monitoring. So one of the things that we're doing at Arctic Wolf in conjunction with NetGain, right, is we're looking at the entirety of your threat landscape, and we're taking in, what's in the cloud, what's on the firewalls, network, that EDR as well, and so forth. So we're really trying to unify your security arsenal, right? That is truly what we're doing. Instead of just looking at this portion of things, we want to look at everything holistically, right? Because if you're not looking at everything holistically, well, then something might happen in the cloud, right? Or in an email account, and you might miss it. So it's really, really important for organizations today to think kind of beyond like an endpoint or an antivirus, right? Like what else is out there? What does my attack surface look like? And how can I further protect that? Things like external vulnerabilities or account takeovers are things to be considered, things to take into consideration. And, one thing I will mention about Arctic Wolf MDR, and we'll get into this, right, is we'll actually leverage your existing technology stack. We're vendor agnostic, meaning that we will work with what you have in place, right? We're not looking to rip and replace a bunch of tools you made an investment in, but we'll actually be that additional layer to look at things holistically for you.
Oh, but you have all these tools and all these log creating devices within your infrastructure. Certainly you're going to charge more for the more data that they have to ingest, right? Did Mike freeze on us?
Nope. So we actually do not charge by data ingested, and I'm glad you brought it up, Scott. So one of the things I think that's important, right, is there's others out there in the industry where you will get charged by data ingested. And one of the reasons we don't do that, right, and we take a hard stance in this, is if you're picking and choosing what data to send us, then what are we missing, right? If you're taking costs into consideration, well, we don't want to send these logs there because it's going to up our bill. Well, then we're not able to do our job with protecting your network, right? When you're picking and choosing what to send us. So that is another piece of how we look at things holistically. We want to see everything. We want to work with everything that's in place. We want to take a holistic view of what's actually happening in your network and not force you into situations where you pick and choose what data to send us or what sources of telemetry to be ingested, right? The whole purpose is so we can get an accurate picture of your entire threat landscape.
And on that note, I'm going to transition into our discussion around what people can do today to prepare themselves and level up their security posture. So I'd like both Scott and Mike to cover some of these key security practices that businesses should be implementing if they are not already. And Mike, I'm going to hand it over to you first.
Oh, okay, sounds good. And I think my slide, there we go. All right, so talking about kind of Arctic Wolf that's okay, are we good?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about kind of Arctic Wolf and the platform in depth. And Scott, I'll lean on you as the technical master of this, but what we do. So we've discussed a lot of it, and one of the things that I think is really important, right, is we're going to ingest all your sources of telemetry, meaning that we're going to take everything into account from your network, your cloud, your endpoints, and so on. You can see that part of how we do this is through a physical sensor, right? Is we're going to actually put a 1U physical sensor in your environment that will collect all of that traffic. We also have an agent that's a part of our program, right? So we roll that agent out to endpoints and servers. But beyond that, we're also going to look at your cloud, right? And I know, Scott, I think we were reviewing this the other day, and you were like, you guys have more API connectors than that. And you're right. That is absolutely just kind of a smattering of API connectors. Some of the more common ones we see, right? If you're using Office 365 for email, that is absolutely something we want to monitor. So we roll that all into our SOC and our Arctic Wolf platform. We run it through threat intelligence feeds, and then it goes into human investigation, right? So you'll notice kind of right here in the middle, we have what we call our concierge security team. This is critical in what we do, right? We are working with you, and you're getting named experts and resources to help you work on your IT security related initiatives, right? These are the folks that, Scott mentioned earlier, like they're hard to find. They're the ones with their CISSP credentials like Scott has, or their CSSPs and so on down the list. And they're becoming named resources for you and really becoming a force multiplier for your IT team, right? They're going to help you with all those security related things, bring that guidance and expertise to the relationship. So, Scott, you are the technical expert far more than I could. Did I miss anything there? Anything else you wanted to highlight on this?
Well, I mean, first of all, just to reflect more on the concierge team, this is a dedicated resource to the organization. So when you call in for support, you call in assistance, you received an alert, you need to know more information about, you're asking for John, not some guy on the security team to help you out. You know this person, they know you, they know your organization, they know how you work, they know how the organization works. They can more quickly identify the false positives based on how applications are supposed to work within the organization. So having that one-to-one with a security pro in this particular instance is just so dynamic for you to be able to be quicker to execute your response, execute your remediation, whatever it is, by having that security pro available to you on a first name basis. That's a big win. And then all of these touch points of influence, it's not just the server log, it's not just an endpoint log. Look at the different points of influence, the DNS logins that can be done, the AD logins that occur, the wireless logins that can occur. There are so many points of influence where it can recognize threat in the organization and provide you the understanding of where you need to execute your remediation. That is so advantageous. And what I mean by provide you the source, they not only tell you what the threat is, they tell you how to fix it, what it is that you need to do in order to properly maintain or remove that threat from your organization in great detail with CV information for getting more detailed information about the threat, to how it was discovered, what the threat index was, what was it that was identified that made it threatening, to help you once again further along your ability to remediate the influence. So big wins with the concierge teams, big wins with the amount of influence of data that it provides.
Yeah, and then, one thing I'd like to add here, Caroline and Scott, is, we've talked about MDR solutions, right, in the last couple of slides. And I think one stat that caught my attention last year that Gartner reported is that it was about 10% of companies, regardless of size, were using an MDR solution. By 2025, that's going to be closer to 50% is what they have predicted. And the reason that I point that out is because when we're talking about leveling up security and what folks are doing in order to do that, they are moving towards an MDR, managed detection and response model, in order to further secure their networks, right? And I think one of the things that's important is that if every business could, right, they'd build an internal SOC, wouldn't they, Scott, right? Everybody would. But we've talked about some of the things of why that's hard, costs, constraints around IT folks, or security folks, I should say. And so one of the things that an MDR solution is doing is MDR is bringing you that SOC to you, right? And then SOC as a service, if you will, that is managing your alerts, doing the human investigation and so forth. And then, like Scott said, with the concierge security team, providing all of that guidance and how you fix things, not just saying, hey, here, good luck with the alerts, we'll catch you next week, hope it all works out. Actually working alongside of you in your security journey and making sure that your threat posture is improving over time, right? And I think that's really, really important to discuss when you're thinking about leveling up your security.
Okay, I'm going to take that pause as an opportunity for our panelists to take a quick breather, and I'm now going to post a poll to all of our webinar attendees. Everybody should be seeing a poll right now, and I am going to take this time to review some of the questions that we've had coming in through the chat. So I'll give everyone, a few seconds to respond to the poll. Let me look through some of these questions that we've got in here. Oh, we've got some interesting ones. Okay, this should be good. Give it a few more seconds. I'll close it out. Okay, and we're back. I'm gonna transition us into Q&A. Can everyone still see my screen? Does it say Q&A? Been
It
having
does.
some
Yep.
PowerPoint challenges, so.
It is there.
Okay, good. Thanks, Scott. So let's hop into some of the questions that we've had come in through the chat. So this is interesting. I heard that a casino was hacked through their smart thermostat. Can that really happen? Yes. Internet of Things.
I'll take that one, Scott. I'm actually familiar with this story. Yeah, I can jump on that one. So yes, this is true. Actually, this is a story that my solutions engineer loves to tell, right? Because people just find it so absurd, right? And we live in this age where everything's connected to Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and so forth. So this actually was a casino that the thermostat was on the fish tank. So it was like a thermometer on the fish tank, right? Gauging what temperature that was, making sure to keep the fish alive and so forth. And what's funny is the bad guys took a foothold within this thermostat. Then they spread to the rest of the network. And what they actually did was they went into the high roller database. Then they took that information out through the thermostat and uploaded that information into the cloud, right? So this is one of those wild stories that shows you that like everything can be an attack vector, right? And we're kind of talking about doing more than EDR. This is a perfect example of that, right? Is where Internet of Things, there's a lot of attack surface out there that you have to be taking into consideration. Wild story. I wish I remembered the rest of it as far as like what happened, did they mitigate it, was the data gone forever, most likely, just kind of one of those crazy ones. Great question.
So if you're thinking about a smart fridge, maybe think twice. Oh my goodness. Okay, so let me toss out another question that we've had come in. My business is small, under 10 employees, and I can't imagine my data has any value to cyber criminals. Would we still be a target? Scott, do you want to handle this one? Because
I was going to say, can I take that one?
Yeah,
Take that one? Because I hear that all the time. Every time I go out to organizations, they're saying, we're so small, we're not an attack vector, or nobody's going to come after us. My data is not sensitive. Come on. Everybody's an attack vector. The script kiddies are out there. They're looking for openings. If they find one, they're going to process it. They're going to try to brute force their way in, and they'll probably be successful if you're not leveraging proper control. I think I saw something like over 50% of small businesses are hit in cyber attacks. It's not a direct focus attack. They're not just going after the Chase banks. They're going after the small enterprises because they are going to take advantage of the fact that they don't believe that they're targets and their enterprise isn't properly structured to be protected. So they're going to go after that. And a lot of times, and this is unfortunate, when these small businesses get hit, they go out of business. They don't survive a ransomware attack where all their data was compromised and reputational damage ruined them. That happens a lot. And it's unfortunate. But to think that you're not a target is a mistake because they are depending on you to think that way.
And two, Scott, something that you just said that kind of brought up a thought too is some of the supply chain challenges that we've been seeing with cybercrime recently, and businesses being indirectly impacted by attacks that are targeted more towards larger enterprises. So could you talk a little bit about that, what that's been looking like?
Well,
especially recently, go ahead, yeah.
There's great examples of that. I mean, you go back to the Target attack a few years ago, they got influenced by an HVAC provider. This is going back to cyber insurance, this is a vector or a question that they ask in the questionnaire for getting your cyber insurance renewed of, are you executing proper vendor management? Are you reviewing all of your connection points, all of your influence into your infrastructure from third parties, that they're practicing good protection and good security as well? It is an enormous amount of impact for organizations. And one of the top threat vectors that are out there, ransomware, I think is one, but it's two. It's high on the list of I think account takeover, maybe three. But this is something that a lot of businesses just simply aren't prepared for. They're not prepared for that third party that has access into their enterprise, even if it's small, because a lot of businesses, believe it or not, they're very small in how they organize their LAN. So it's very simplistic. It's what we call flat. And so you can have a point of influence coming over here and landing in HR, but it has its way to get to accounting. And that's a mistake in a lot of businesses, but that's the way it is. And they're small enough, they don't have the structure to separate the data sets from each other. And so you've got to be very strongly protective against an influence from the outside into organizations. And keep in mind that it could be a third party to the third party. So a third party has an influence to somebody that gets into them, and because they have a reference to you, now they can process it to you. So it's very important to do proper vendor due diligence in maintaining safe that type of attack.
Okay, I got one more question that just recently came in. I've got a few, but this one I think is pretty solid and a pretty good takeaway for folks. So how do you continually educate and alert end users? They get tired of warnings and alerts, fake phishing emails, etc. So like what can we do for continual education for employees?
Well, I'll take that one, Mike. So social awareness testing is something that businesses need to leverage. Going once again back to the cyber insurance influence, that is one of the main controls that have to be in place for your organization. You have to leverage proper social awareness testing and training for your employees. And it's not something that you do one time when the employee's hired, it's something that you do continually. As the question asks, how do we do that? Well, there are programs out there that NetGain provides that can do a constant testing, phishing, exploit throughout the enterprise across your entire user base on a recurring basis. You don't want to do it too much. You don't want to create fatigue on the end user that they become callous to the emails, or maybe they quit answering emails at all because they become over callous to the influence of phishing. So there is a balance of how much you influence those organizations with the phish testing, but it's certainly important. You have to improve their understanding. And should they fail, you want to put them through a proper training program so that they can learn what they did wrong. This isn't a punishment program. It's an educational program. We're trying to improve them. They're the weakest link in our security chain. They are. They're already inside the enterprise. They're already inside the firewall. Anything that's trying to be protective on the outside has already been bypassed. They're on the inside. So they have to understand what and how they approach a breach of something that influenced through email systems or maybe even phone systems, like a phishing attack. That's a V with a V for phishing. And those voice types of attacks sometimes will set up a phishing attack. So they'll get a phone call that says, hey, we're going to be sending you an email for blah, blah, blah. And then when you get that email, it's malicious, but you were expecting it. So now they've raised your level of trust to be able to open that email. So it's very important that you practice good social awareness testing and training for your organization, and you do it continuously so that they constantly understand. And threats change, so you want to be able to influence that understanding to your users by doing it throughout the year.
Most definitely. Okay, I've got one more question, and then this will be the last one, and we'll close things out. So you guys mentioned alert noise, skill shortage, and response time. What other gaps in security are out there that we should be concerned about? Mike, I'm going to toss this one to you.
Yeah, could you repeat that one more time, Caroline? I didn't quite catch it.
Yeah, so we mentioned alert noise, skill shortage, and response time. What other gaps in security are out there that we should be concerned about?
Yeah, so I think just gaps in general, right? I mean, Scott just kind of touched on one, right? That's glaring in my eyes is the user education piece. I mean, the reality is right, that users are the ones who punch in their credentials. They're the ones who click on the phishing link. I always kind of like to sum it up as they're the weakest link in the cybersecurity chain. So I think that's one gap that we just talked about, right? Where it's users being educated. I know that's always a challenging task, you know, that Scott just mentioned, right? How do you keep them engaged? And I think the question before mentioned, like, they get tired of these warnings and alerts and everything else. And I hear that loud and clear, right? And so I think there's some really good programs out there that help with like relevant content and making sure it's engaging content and things of that nature. So I think, user education is a big one. I also think that as far as gaps go, right, like we didn't really talk much about vulnerability scanning, but I know Scott would echo this just because Scott and I work closely together, right? But vulnerability scanning is important. And then the other thing too, I think, is not knowing where you stand, right? Like, so Scott, I know you'll do things like a security assessment or a network assessment, right? And I think that's a really important thing to do, right? Is to have a really good base level understanding of like, what's what, right? What's going on? Where are vulnerabilities? Where are those gaps and so forth? And I think we run into too many companies that kind of skip that step, that don't have an understanding of what's actually going on in their environment. And I think they should, right, before they do anything and so forth.
Yeah, I totally agree, Mike. I see it all the time when I go to organizations, these gaps, these glowing gaps that exist in their security posture, and just a few of them that we haven't mentioned already. Understanding where your assets are, an inventory. You won't believe how many organizations cannot produce an inventory of all of their assets. If you don't know where your assets are, then how are you supposed to protect them? You set it and forget it type of ideology with a lot of your controls. A lot of IT teams let controls get stale. They set them up initially, they're doing what they need to do, but they don't grow with the organization. They need to be constantly readdressed. Those configs need to be reviewed. You need to remove things that no longer need to be connected to your enterprise. There's just a lot of staleness in a lot of the configs that are out there. And a lot of systems, a lot of businesses out there just do not patch effectively. They don't keep systems up to date with the latest protections that are available in those particular operating systems or application level patching. They're just absent. There needs to be a very strong amount of patching controls that are executed against the enterprise. And actively monitoring your infrastructure for threat, not only in an MDR platform, but also in an EDR platform. Having a strong level of antivirus is not bad. I heard a lot of people say AV's gone. It's not as effective as it used to be, certainly, but I wouldn't remove it. It certainly does provide a layer of defense, and you should position all of your controls in a layer factor. Let one protect the other as you move on. But that's something I see common is that AVs are not executed against servers. Come on, you gotta protect at every level. There's no reason to exclude that. And having an incident response plan, I made mention about that, I think previously, having a verified incident response plan, having a DR strategy and a backup strategy that's been verified to recover your data is the thing that helps you sleep better at night. You can be as protective as you want, but unless you're able to restore, you're in trouble if you get breached.
So we actually have one more question that popped in that kind of ties directly into what Scott just said. So can Arctic Wolf assist a company in the event of a breach?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? And so one of the things I'll point out too, right, is we're focused on preventing the breach, right, and mitigating a breach. So, and I'm not certain who asked the question, but I'd love to walk you through like some examples of when a client of ours got ransomware and how we stopped that in 30 minutes. So there's part of this that's the response, right? Getting you a mitigation plan. We are unlimited remote incident support, right? So we're going to help you from abroad. We are not a company that will fly folks out and be like hands-on keyboard, boots on ground situation. That's somewhere where like Scott, I would recommend, you get in touch with Scott or somebody like that that can help you in that situation. One thing I'll note, and there's kind of a more to come on this, is we actually just acquired a company called Tetra Defense, right, to kind of round out our approach to cybersecurity. And Tetra Defense is one of the leaders in incident response for these things. And they do those kind of high level like digital forensic and so forth. And we're still kind of putting shape around that, and there'll be kind of more news to come. But, that's one, Scott, and I think you'll probably agree that like, we'd love to walk them through a live situation, right? Of here's what happened when a customer got ransomware. Here's how we mitigated it. Here's how that CST team stepped in and provided the customer with a response. And we can do things like threat containment and, device containment, things like that Scott can probably more articulately from a technical side speak to.
Well, and that was going to be my point, is you do have the ability to contain an infected system. Whether that happens at 3 o'clock in the morning, doesn't matter. You can take it offline so that when IT gets to work at 8 o'clock in the morning, they got notice of a system that was removed from the network because it was threatened. But NetGain, we're your soldiers. If there's a leverage that Arctic Wolf is positioning its MDR platform against, and you need somebody to respond to that incident, boots on the ground, hands to keyboards, that's what we do.
And with that, I'm going to close it out. It's a good note to end it on. So huge thank you to Scott and Mike for all the information and guidance they've shared today around cybersecurity. I hope everyone found this webinar informative and helpful, and you can walk away with some maybe new or different ideas for how to better strategize and position your security posture. So I am going to be sending out some gift cards to some lucky folks before the end of the day, so stay tuned to your inbox for that. And another quick reminder that we're going to be sharing the details around this webinar in an email with a link to the recording and some additional information. So look for that to be shared within the next few days. So thank you so much once again to Mike and Scott. And with that, I will close the webinar, and I hope everyone has a great Tuesday.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks.
Thank